Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Deep Histories of Marvel. Now, today I would like to talk about the Fantastic Four. I know we've seen their origin twice in the movies, and that this comic book has been around a long time. It is the oldest comic that Marvel has to their name, if you exclude the old 1940s stuff. It's the very first of the heroic age 1960s comics, and it was like their flagship, and it was the underlying base that the rest of the comic universe was built on. So I wanted to go back to the very first Fantastic Four comic book from 1961 and talk about their origins and what it was like and how different it was from what we've seen in the two different origin movies that they have out there. So, 1961, Reed Richards is working on a rocket of his own design for the U.S. government, trying to beat the communists so that America could be the first humans in space. So this sets it in roughly somewhere before April of 1961. And the comic opens with Reed talking about stealing his own rocket because they're concerned that the communists are going to beat him, and he doesn't want to wait. He doesn't want to get permission from the government. He doesn't want to take the time to make sure they understand enough about cosmic radiation and what they can expect to find in space. He's dead set that America's got to be first, and the only way to do that is stealing our own rocket, launching it myself, and just so I can say I'm the first man in space. Now, of course, Reed was intending to take his best friend, Ben Grimm, with him, because Ben was an experienced pilot. And while Reed was a lot of things, genius, scientist, inventor, he was not nearly as skilled with piloting rockets or planes or what have you as Ben. But Ben wanted nothing to do with it. He was convinced that going into space like this, stealing the rocket and running off haphazard was going to get him killed. And Susan Storm, who at this point is the girlfriend of Reed Richards, she was there, and she's the one that convinces Ben to go by calling him a coward. But it's important to note that in this iteration, in this time frame, she was not a scientist. She was just billed as Reed Richards' girlfriend, and the only reason why she goes is because of that. Because I'm your girlfriend, I'm going. End of story. And her brother Johnny, which if we say that he's roughly the same age as Spider-Man, and Spider-Man being 15 in 1963, that would make Johnny at this point maybe 13, maybe 14. But he goes simply because his sister is going. He adds nothing to the mission. There's no reason for him to be there. And he's not a stowaway. It's just, he's like, I'm going to, you can't stop me. So Reed takes this motley crew of his best friend and these other two that have no business being there, and they sneak onto this base, and they launch this rocket with zero resistance. I mean, the comic itself only shows one guard being on duty, and that had to be all they had. Just one dude standing out there for the four of them to get this rocket prepped and launched with no one trying to stop them. And once they hit space, it's exactly like Ben Grimm feared. They didn't know anything about being in space or cosmic radiation or what to expect, and they get up there and that rocket is completely unshielded, and every one of them gets irradiated. And the Geiger counter starts going off, and they're all irradiated, and Johnny Storm gets super hot, and then Ben gets real heavy, and he can't pilot the rocket anymore, and he knocks the controls, and the whole thing just falls back to Earth. Yeah, so other than Ben feeling really heavy and being unable to pilot the rocket, and Johnny getting really hot, their powers don't activate until they get back to Earth and they crawl out of the crawl out of the rocket. there is no going to the hospital and being checked out and the powers kicking in later, like the 2005 movie does. There's no snowboarding scene with a hot nurse where Johnny bursts into flames. None of that happens. Now, as soon as they get out of the ship, the rocket, and Ben's hostile, and while they're arguing, their powers kick in. Sue Storm disappears, Johnny bursts into flames and sets everything on fire around him. Ben turns into the thing with all the rocks and the strength, and he starts trying to beat Reed Richards with a tree. And yes, because he's mad at him, but also he's triggered because what he doesn't talk about, and what isn't talked about in the movies or really later on in the comics, is that Ben was just as much in love with Sue as Reed was. So when they got down there and they started transforming, and he was mad at Reed anyway, and he turns into this big hulking monster, and then Reed starts going on about Sue disappearing and calling her darling and stuff. He gets mad, and he's like, that's enough, and he grabs a tree and he goes try to beat him with it. But that is what triggers Reed to move and get all rubbery. So once they've calmed down, before they've ever gone back to the city or reported back to the base, they decide, standing right there in the middle of their fight and the wreckage and the fire, they decide that, we're going to use these powers to do good. Well, I should say that Reed decided they were going to use their powers to do good, and the others just agreed with him. And from there, the Fantastic Four was born. Yeah, so that is quite a bit different from what happened in 2005, where they intermixed, Victor Von Doom into the middle of all that, and they were on a space station instead of a rocket in the 60s, and they had a cosmic storm came over the space station, and they weren't properly shielded. That's way different. And the whole delay when their powers come down, and then they cram in a lot of other stuff about Reed trying to cure Ben and turning back human, and then Ben deciding to be the thing to help fight Doom, and that weirdness with Doom slowly turning into metal. All of that was really different from the comics. And both of those are a really far cry from the 2015 movie, because it was based more on the Ultimate Comics origin, which was a modern early 2000s retelling of the Fantastic Four story, as opposed to the 1960s one that I just told you about. Alright, so yeah, that's the story I wanted to tell, to show you the 1960s origin and how different it is from what you may or may not know. But they're considered Marvel's first family, the bedrock of the Marvel comic universe, and everything ties back to them. All the 60s comics, eventually the Fantastic Four gets connected in there somehow, even if it's just a cameo. So talking about the Marvel origins and Marvel in the 60s, you really gotta understand the Fantastic Four and how important they were. So that does it for this episode. Thank you for listening, and I'm glad you were here. Glad you were stuck with me. And so I'll catch you next time.